Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain is a story of a boy named Huck and his friendship with a runaway slave named Jim. Huck lives with Widow Douglas. His mom is dead and his dad is a town drunk. Widow Douglas owns a slave named Jim, and her sister is trying to teach Huck how to be civilized. Huck, who always did what he wanted, did not like the Widow Douglas and would sneak out at night to meet his good friend Tom Sawyer. They would meet other friends at a raft and would sail down the river to a cave where they would pretend to be a band of robbers. The next morning, when Huck got back from the cave, he saw his dad, the town drunk, who Huck thought was dead, in his bedroom, tearing a note. "I hate Widow Douglas," Huck's dad said. "She's making you into a pretty boy." Pap, as Huck called him, grabbed Huck and said, "I'm taking you with me. I'm going to lock you up where no one will ever find you." Huck, now locked in his pap's house, alone, while his pap went to town, found a saw blade and started to cut through the wall to make his escape. But his pap returned too soon and told him to go fish for dinner. While fishing, he hit a boat to help him escape down the river. The next day, Pap returned to town, and Huck finished his hole and made his way outside. Then he chopped down the door and found some red berries that he rubbed on the walls to look like his blood to convince his Pap and the town that he had been murdered. Huck set sail on his hidden boat and made his way to a nearby island. On the island he found Jim, who had run away because he heard Widow Douglas and her sister talking about selling him for $800 to a family in Mississippi. The next day they found a raft and made it into a house. The next day a storm came up and flooded nearby land in the Mississippi River. The flood was so bad that when Huck and Jim were on the raft, a house floated by. Huck and Jim went in it and saw a dead man, Huck's pap. They grabbed a dress with coins sewn into the hems, but kept the dress for later purposes. Huck put on the dress and went ashore to find out if people actually believed that he had really died. He went to a woman's house where she invited him in. She knew he was not a girl, but she confirmed that Huck was dead. He admitted that he was a boy, but did not say his name. When Huck left the house, the lady gave him some advice on how to better act like a girl, which would come in handy several days later. Huck and Jim became great friends and did everything together. Huck would read adventure stories to Jim. It was very foggy one night, and the raft was hit by a steamboat. Huck and Jim fell off the raft. Huck swam to shore. Jim swam after what was left of the raft. Jim searched for Huck, but couldn't find him. He eventually fell asleep. Huck found Jim asleep on the raft and woke him up. Jim had told Huck he was worried about him and thought he was dead. When Jim was asleep, two men paddled up to the raft. They asked if anyone else was on the raft. Huck knew they were looking for the runaway slave, Jim. He lied and said he was on the boat with his father. The men asked to see his father, but Huck told them his father had smallpox. The men thought they were helping Huck, so they floated some money over on a piece of wood. Life was fine for Huck and Jim on the raft, with no one to bother them. But every time they went near the shore, problems seemed to start. One day, two men ran up to the raft and asked for a ride. Huck let them on, and as they paddled away, a crowd of people appeared at the shore, shouting at the men. The men introduced themselves as the Duke and the King. Huck knew they were not, but Jim believed them. The Duke and King got Huck and Jim involved in their next plan to get money, a play. They would create a play that townspeople would come to see,
and pay them lots of money.
They put advertisements for the play.
At the courthouse, 3 nights only, the world-famous tragic actors, 50 cents admission, and women and children not admitted. The night of the play, many men arrived to see the show. The play was 2 minutes long, and all they saw was the king naked on all fours, painted bright colors, and dancing like a wild animal. The men realized they had been swindled, but still told the other townspeople it was a great show. A few days later, they heard that a man in the town had died, and his brother from England was stuck in England and could not attend the funeral. So the king and the duke pretended to be long-lost relatives of the dead man. Huck carried their bags. They dressed Jim up like a dead man and left him with the raft, hoping to scare off anyone who attempted to steal the raft. The king and the duke learned more about the dead man's family, so they could better pretend to be his family members. They rehearsed their roles.
On the day before the funeral, the king and the duke introduced themselves as if they knew everyone, and everyone welcomed them as if they were family.
When they got to the house, the king took the dead man's will and changed it, so all the money would go to him. Then he told Huck to count the money. The doctor, who was also there, discovered the king and the duke were frauds, but could not convince anyone else in the family. That night, Huck was looking for the money, but when he heard the king and the duke coming, he hid behind the dresses in the closet and heard the king and the duke talking about where the money was. When the king and the duke left, Huck found the money and hid it under his mattress. When everyone was asleep, he walked downstairs and put the money in the coffin with the dead man. The next day was the funeral. When they buried the man, no one knew about the money. After the funeral, Huck told the dead man's eldest daughter that he had hidden the money in the coffin and told her not to tell anyone. Then he wrote her a letter explaining how to retrieve the money. He told her to put a single candle in the window when the duke and the king were gone, and 2 days after they left, dig up the coffin and get the money. The duke asked Huck where the money was, but Huck lied and said the king had it. The duke went to see the king. That night, as Huck returned to the house, he saw a single candle in the window, so he ran back to the raft because he didn't want the duke and king to leave without him. He saw the king and the duke fighting, thinking the other one knew where the money was. Huck went to talk to Jim, but could not find him, so he went ashore to find Jim. He asked a boy, and the boy told him Jim was going to be hanged in 4 days and that he was at the big house down the road, the house where Tom Sawyer's aunt lived. He decided to pretend to be Tom, who Aunt Sally hadn't seen in 2 years, thinking this would help him find Jim. But Huck forgot that Tom was going to be visiting his Aunt Sally that very day. When Tom arrived, Huck told him to pretend he was Tom's little brother, Sid, and he did. That night, they sneaked out to the shed, where Jim was staying. They tried to rescue him, but when they arrived, they saw another slave with his hand ringlets guarding the shed. The slave believed that keeping hand ringlets would keep the witches away. They asked the slave if they could talk to Jim. He said yes. Huck and Tom told Jim they would try to rescue him the next night. The next night, they tried to dig into Jim's room. They crawled into Jim's room and woke him up. Jim insisted that his escape would be like those in the adventure stories Huck used to read. The 3 discovered a plan for Jim's escape. When the sun rose, Huck and Tom returned to Aunt Sally's house. As part of Jim's escape plan, Huck dressed as a lady and wrote a letter telling Aunt Sally that someone would steal Jim that very night. The letter asked Aunt Sally to get together lots of people with guns to make this a dramatic escape, just like Jim wanted. And so, that night, the three escaped to the raft in a hail of bullets as they were chased by an angry mob, just like an escape from the books Huck read. Unfortunately, Tom was struck in the leg with a bullet, and Jim was captured again. Huck wrote a letter to Aunt Sally telling her the truth and hid it in the bookshelf. Why did it have to be like this? Why couldn't all men be treated the same and be free like Huck and Jim were when they were on the raft in the Mississippi? While Jim was in jail and Tom was recovering at the doctor's, it was discovered that the widow Douglas had died and her will set Jim free. Tom then brought Jim to Huck and told him the good news.